it is known today and serves, in terms of this, what we speak about, as extremely negative psychological disorder. So when epithet narcissist is given to someone, it's not a lightly taken epithet. Think for yourself. Trump was called a narcissist. But what I want to draw your attention to is to complexity of the myth and what the modern psychology did by turning it into an archetype of what Narcissus stood for as a character, as an archetype, and what part it plays in the formation of a healthy, developed psyche. You see? Because, and I'm not here trying to force my point of view, but to me there is an area of tremendous dissatisfaction of the way that archetype has been developed and kind of scrutinized the myth and gave the myth, or extracted out of that myth, that what is inevitably applicable to absolutely every one of us. Not because we live in the age of individualism. This age that we live, the culture that we have created, is most perfectly tailored for individual aspirations. One could say, what's wrong with that? Isn't that the very noble promise of democracy? Isn't the very principle of democracy is to allow and afford freedom of expression of every individual? I'm not going to go into whether democracy is even has the chance to exist, whether democracy is possible, but simply bring this out into the open for reconsideration of what could be in the myth of Narcissus that is now heavily laid as a stamp, as that kind of stamp of disapproval. And although the very traits of personality, or the personality traits, are known to be utterly negative in terms of what we consider to be an evolved human being, right? What could be worse than lack of empathy? That is terrible at an individual level and catastrophic when it reaches collective level of level of proportions at the collective level. Lack of empathy is a dangerous thing. When this or that nation or culture get infected with that, the outcome is a disaster. Obviously, excessive obsession with one's looks, with the way one is perceived, is known as egocentrism. And one could argue that today, from the point of view of the language used in psychoanalysis, narcissism equals to egocentrism. It's the one and the same. But the story of Narcissus has something else in it. And to me, what I'm pointing out, that gloss given by contemporary psychoanalysis missed the opportunity to find these other aspects, this unseen, subtle dimension that the myth of Narcissus represents. After all, he rejects the real love represented in the being of Echo, only to give himself to that solitude which resulted in falling in love with his reflection And if we are to follow the myth, it's not that he did that somehow voluntarily or involuntarily, but this was nothing other than the curse which he had to carry, coming from a greater dimension of reality that Aphrodite represented. After all, she was the goddess of love, much higher being in the hierarchy that the Mount Olympus represented. Do you see? There is something interesting, fascinating, dark, mysterious in the story of Narcissus, where he is being cursed by falling in love with that which consumes him and does not give him the possibility of reconciliation. No need to rush. No need to come and jump with hastily made conclusions like perhaps Sigmund Freud did. No need to frame. After all, the beauty of Ovid's Metamorphosis was that every story had that aspect to it which led to its title. And we know that in a story, Narcissus, when he is consumed with the love for himself, which is irreconcilable, he is turned into a flower which carries his name. In some versions it's called a daffodil, but also it's known as narcissus, as spring flowers that blossom in many parts of parks, not just in England. Yellow and cream white. There are a variety of them, with their heads tilted down. Whether Narcissus carries his name after the flower or the flower is named after Narcissus is beside the point. The act of metamorphosis here is of value. So to me, it's simply personally felt for a long time, and I'm really kind of pleased for the occasion to reflect this certain sense of dissatisfaction of how the beautiful myth has been turned into something as a psychopathological no, it almost like sounds as a, some people maybe would prefer to be diagnosed schizophrenics than narcissists. I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm just wondering. Because it's considered to be utterly socially unacceptable unless someone completely takes this other extreme, and if being called Narcissus somehow gives them a kick. I don't know if Trump was very happy being called narcissist or greatest narcissist, or he felt that this was an insult to a great ancient hero. I haven't got a clue. I'm just pondering. So this myth, you see, offers another dimension. This other dimension is very interesting. You see this possibility. And I want to make this leap now, a leap of faith, or a quantum leap, whatever you may call it. Some of you who are familiar with poetry of Rumi, you might have come across this line, which has variously translated, sounds something like, when you will know or behold the glory of yourself, you will become the adulterer. Have you heard that? Or something along these lines? What does it say here? What does it mean? What is this pronunciation? What is this proclamation? What is this admonition? when you will behold yourself, the poet said, the mystic Sufi poet declares here, you will become an adulterer. You will become a worshipper of yourself. You see? This line is almost an echo of the doctrine of universal egoity that Kashmir Shaivism is known for. That universal egoity which doesn't recognize the existence of individual ego as an entity in its own right, but only sees this as Shiva in disguise. Therefore, egoity is only universal egoity. Anything else is simply a sign of psychopathology, a psychosis of sorts. And this is why it is not easy to have that completely transfigured way of relating to oneself, where one's identity has no ground other than in Shiva, other than in supreme reality of who one is. And that's what Rumi exclaims. Once you know the glory of yourself, you will become the worship of yourself. That's what the line here represents. You see? It's a poetic way on that same theistic way of annihilation. Instead of saying I don't exist, only God exists, it's saying that in a different way. It takes the guts to admit that. So that line, a thin and fine silver thread, connects all this. If you are care to hold it, as the Ariadne's one, to take you out of the maze of self-imprisonment of whom you consider yourself to be. In reality, there is nothing other than the state Kashmir Shaivism refers to as universal egoity. Everything else are just degrees of various undeveloped ahamkaras, various ways of how our individuality hasn't yet fully took its rightful maturity. It's a state of adolescence. Nothing to be ashamed, but nothing to parade about either. So therefore, many spiritual teachings that bash ego, many spiritual teachings that drop your ego and what have you, miss this crucial aspect. Because if ego was something that one could drop or go beyond, then this would have been a piece of cake. But the ego here is not an instrumentality. It's not a thing in itself. And even ahamkara is a principle of individuation. So, yes, if you hear or heard Alan Watts, he made it very clear, even through cartoons, as there are plenty on the YouTube now these days. It's like animated talks of Alan Watts. The ego is that part that is now being on display as various garments we wear. We are naked, come into this world naked, and always remain naked. Whatever we put on ourselves that gives that projection of how we want to be perceived is called ego. But the naked reality of who we are is not that, and unperturbed by that, not soiled by that, nor is usurped by that either. So this kind of trying to locate or trying to find a black cat in a dark room where the cat is not present becomes a doubtful affair sooner or later. For some people it takes lifetime to square the affair with their own egos or ego. And it is that story of a cat who was never in the room. Answer to who is in the room or what is it? Well, if you've been attentive enough, there is no answer. It cannot be put into words, because soon as we try to locate that, we are going to run a great risk at distorting it there and then. Because that experience is extremely subtle and extremely liberating. Admonition and acknowledgement. So I wanted to speak to this in just drawing this analogy through the myth of Narcissus. Whatever may spring forth, or whatever may be a response, as I've mentioned, is of more value than the exact meaning of the words. It's what had the chance to resurface, what had the chance to be recognized and acknowledged. It's of value. And with this, I suggest we turn to questions now.